Welcome to Curious Campus, where we talk to professors from various departments of the University of Toronto about a recent research topic they've dived into, breaking down these new developments for everyone to understand. Stay tuned, you'll definitely learn something new. I'm Cynthia, and today I'm here with Professor Joseph Baker, and we're going to talk about their research in their new paper, Is It Time to Retire Talent from Discussions of Athlete Development? And without further ado, let's begin. Joseph Baker is a professor of sports science here at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. He's also the Tanenbaum Chair in Sports Science, Data Modeling, and Sports Analytics at U of T. He's the past president of the Canadian Society for Psychomotor Learning and Sports Psychology and has authored and edited many books, chapters, and articles. Joseph's research focuses on the optimal development of the human body, how one can achieve ultimate performance, and how someone can maintain that degree of performance. More specifically, today we're here to talk about talent. In his article titled, Is It Time to Retire Talent from Discussions of Athlete Development? He examines what it means to be talented in the world of athletics and the controversy around its use in the field. And without further ado, Joseph, welcome to Curious Campus.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you here. And to start us off with, a good starting question here, what led you to become a professor in sports science and to conduct research in this field of study?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a linear pathway. I discovered sports science, I think, relatively late in my development. That was after a diploma in law enforcement. It was after a master's degree in education and child psychology. And then it was a year between my master's and PhD where I worked for the Australian Institute of Sport. And they're doing amazing things in Australia with high performance athlete development. And it was like a light bulb moment that, hey, you can do this as a career. You can do this as a job. And then since that experience, it's been full steam ahead in sports science ever since.
Oh, definitely. It's not the first time we've heard that a professor has come upon the research topic rather non-linearly. Yeah. It just seems like things just kind of pop up in life, I
think it's an important takeaway for everyone that even professors that end up in these kinds of positions, which I think for me is a perfect fit, but would never have predicted this as a pathway when I was an undergrad student, for example. Sometimes it's exploring options and finding which ones fit is the best advice that I can give.
Of course. And even within this field, I've seen that this isn't the first article you've written about this idea of talent in the field of athletics. So what drew you to talk about talent as a whole?
I was a high-performance athlete myself. I was a triathlete for 10 years. And so this idea of what are we capable of? What explains the Olympians versus the weekend warriors? That's always been a question that interested me. I think throughout my development, that was something that I was continuously interested in. And then when I got to the point where I could start to look at my own research questions, it was one that was very front of mind. And it wasn't because I think the idea of talent is that valuable. It's that the real valuable stuff that we can tell people is on the other side of this issue of talent. We have to get through this idea of talent and how much we can predict a person's development before we can actually get to the rich stuff on the other side, which is about learning environments and hard work and those kinds of things that are outside the description of talent.
Most definitely. And before we get too deep into what lies on the other side of talent, I think talent is an idea that we're all really used to hearing in like a variety of fields, but maybe thinking about we don't all understand it very well. So I'd like to ask you a very hard to answer question, perhaps, what is talent?
It sounds like such a simple question, but it really is at the heart of why it's been so difficult for us to either come down pro or against this issue of talent, is because if we ask a dozen people, we get a dozen different answers of what talent is. In our research, we try to make it very simple. Talent is the thing that differs between individuals that might affect their predisposition for future success. So if you're a 5-year-old and your predicted height is over 7 feet, then you've got an advantage over shorter people in sports where height matters. You're actually at a disadvantage where they want shorter stature people. So people that are over 7 feet are actually at a disadvantage in sports like gymnastics and diving and those types of things. And so it really, what makes it so challenging is it varies from context to context. And you can't say this is what talent is and apply it across different sports. It's very sport specific.
Would you say almost like it's the nature aspect of like that nature versus nurture argument?
Yeah, when we look at that sort of overused paradigm of nature versus nurture, it would be the nature part. But what makes it even more complicated is that, we're genetic and biological creatures, but we don't stay in the form that we're at. We evolve and change and adapt based on experiences. So even the nature part isn't as nice and clean as nature nurture makes it sound. We're always a combination of both of those things interacting over time.
I see. So that kind of gives almost a sense of unreliability to this idea of designating someone as talented because of how their body changes, especially in the field of sports. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when we get beyond the sort of simple to identify things like height. Yeah, we can predict with pretty good accuracy now future adult height in young kids and adolescents. But height is only one variable that makes a good athlete. And so once we get beyond that, we start to look at things like, aerobic capacity or your brain's ability to identify patterns in offensive and defensive plays, your brain's ability to make creative and accurate decisions. Well, it's really hard to find a talent element to those things because they are the product of experience. They're the product of thousands of hours of training. And so you would look at that and say, well, there's no talent there. But no, you're forgetting the fact that even the things that we learned are to a certain extent affected by the genetic profiles that we have.
That's interesting. And despite like this really complex and somewhat, I almost want to say like, mercurial nature of talent, it's something that we still hear and we still see used very common and ubiquitously in athletics. So how does that kind of look and how does that impact, I guess, the field of athletics, this idea of talent?
Yeah, it's a very pervasive idea. And it's one of the reasons we focused on it in our research. We didn't start out looking at talent. We started out looking at the power of the environment, the power of learning environments that athletes find themselves in, the advantages that people that grow up in small cities have over people that grow up in rural country towns. But in order to understand that, we had to go through this idea of talent. And so the reality is that we have a sports system that tries to identify talent as early as possible. Minor hockey, for example, looks to stream kids around 8-9 years of age. There's an extreme example of European soccer where they drafted or signed a 18-month-old to a 10-year contract at a professional football club. So there's an idea that we can see talent early and we need to identify it and put it into our system as quickly as possible. In our research program, we push back against that assumption very strongly because it assumes that the person that you are at 9 years old or 18 months old is some kind of stable predictor of the person you're going to become. And I think most of us, when we reach adulthood, would say, I'm a completely different person than I was in my childhood or in my adolescence. And I would really hate to be identified by the things that I valued then. But we do that in sport. We look at the way a 9-year-old skates in a hockey competitive program, and we say, well, that person's more likely to end up in the NHL than this other person we're comparing them against. I think there's a fundamental problem with that whole assumption. The challenge is we've got a whole sports system that's based on that at its heart. And so the consequences of that are when we do that to 9-year-olds, the ones that aren't identified for our high performance program don't get the resources, the learning resources that they need to continue to develop. And that's the real consequences. You're providing opportunities to some and you're taking them away from others. And it's the opportunity that's the critical thing in their development, not the talent. The talent just gets mixed up. It's a false correlation between those variables.
I see. This idea of talent kind of being used as a reason to recruit people very young when we can't really, I guess, accurately predict if they are actually more talented or have more potential than other children. Do you feel that the idea of talent motivates this maybe, or maybe something else structurally motivates people to use talent as a reason to do this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if we can split it into those component parts. If you think about why a coach of Adam age or under a 9-year-old hockey players would be looking for talent. It's because they have a short-term priority of winning games that season. And so they might say, well, I'm not really that interested in who makes it to the NHL. I'm interested in who's going to help me win the tournament at the end of the season. And so you'd look and say, well, okay, that's reasonable. But the reality is those decisions that happen at the U9 level have long-term implications for who gets the eventual success. And so it looks like these things shouldn't be interacting with each other, but in fact, the way we've structured sport forces them to interact.
Do you think these kinds of attitudes and practices are universally common across many sports, or are they more prevalent in like some as opposed to others?
They're certainly more prevalent in sports that have high competitive structures where there's a demand for spots on a team, and particularly early in development. If we wait, and we did a project with Rugby Union in the UK where we got them to delay their selections for national team programs until 15 or 16 years of age. If we can delay it into, the period of maturation in adolescence, then our predictions are a lot stronger. But the reality is a lot of sports can't wait or don't wait. And so when you make those selections early on, you're compounding those effects year upon year for those athletes in the system.
I see. And we've kind of touched upon a little bit how this usage of talent kind of creates barriers for some aspiring athletes to kind of enter the field the way they might like. But maybe what are some other barriers or obstacles that are created through this idea of talent being used?
The biggest one is the obstacles to the thing that actually matters, which is your ability to train and practice and engage with your sport in the best learning environments possible. And those learning environments shift based on the requirements of the learner. We don't want to train 7-year-olds or 8-year-olds like we train adults, because they need different things. They need more fun, they need more enjoyment, they need more activity. Their brains aren't fully developed yet. And so really the critical variable in 25 years of doing research in this area is time practicing with a high degree of effort and a high degree of focus. And so if we have anything in our sports system that removes that from an individual, like an early talent selection that says, you know what, you didn't make the team this year, well, then we're undermining the thing that is actually the most important for development, which is long-term engagement.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of has, I'm supposing, a butterfly effect almost, like maybe a lot of, to use the term we're using now, the talented athletes who maybe don't reach that potential or manifest like that quote unquote potential later in life, and they lose out on the opportunity to develop that talent.
Absolutely, which means the earlier we do that to a person, the greater the impact on their long-term likelihood of success, right? So we know from the professional sports drafts of athletes into the NHL or Major League Baseball or the NFL that our predictions when we wait until that late are not very good. And so backing that timeline up even further, now we're, instead of making those predictions in a 19-year-old, we're doing it in a 15-year-old or an 11-year-old or a 9-year-old. The predictions are going to be so much worse. And we know we can't do it at the adult level, so why would we ever think we'd have accuracy doing it at the adolescent or the childhood level?
Would you be able to put some almost like a demarcation between when you think it's too young to start judging an athlete's potential?
I don't know that there's a clear demarcation point. And so that's some of the advice that we give to high performance sport, is to reflect the reality that they live in. Resources for development are not unlimited. The high quality, educated, well-trained coaches are not an unlimited resource. And so eventually they have to make a decision of who gets these resources that are important. And so our advice is wait until the last possible minute that you can do that. Try to come up with ways that you can keep more people engaged in your sport for longer, because anytime you have to reduce that number, it has implications for your system that are not based on accuracy of your ability to identify talent. All of our research shows that those predictions are a lot worse than we need them to be in order to have a system designed in this way.
Now, I've had a thought. I'm not quite sure how you classify dance like ballet in terms of this field, but I'm seeing a few similarities in like this idea that, to my general understanding of how ballet works, you need to start training young because there's something about you have to train your joints to bend a certain way. So would you say, like in cases like these and maybe some sports, it is necessary to pick athletes very young to be able to catch their body's development in a certain way?
The similar argument's been made in gymnastics and to a certain extent in diving, because the aesthetic element of the sport and the biomechanical elements of the sport are so specific that if you don't have a body that's made to bend that way, or that is predisposed to that type of joint flexibility, then maybe it's not the right sport for you. And so I think that's an argument that could be made. I think the challenge is do we need the system to make those selections? So in ballet, for example, or in gymnastics, one of the primary motives of human behavior is a developing sense of competence. We try a lot of things when we're young, and we stick with the ones that we are good at. We stick to the ones that we see that competence. And so if we took the same approach with dance or with gymnastics or these types of sports, we could say, well, I'm going to give you the opportunity to try as much as you want, to give you as many development opportunities as possible. And then we let the person decide whether they want to stick with that activity. So, if we look at the joint flexibility issue, we could help you develop the joint flexibility, but it's going to require this type of training, this type of sacrifice, this type of decision from you, and then you put the agency for that decision on the person as opposed to the system. That person would say, well, you know what, I didn't want to sacrifice my time with friends in order to work on my flexibility. I didn't want to do more dance training because it interfered with my social life or whatever it is. You'd end up with people that still love dance, that still love their sport, but felt ownership over the decision that was made instead of the system deselecting them or saying you're not good enough. Well, they have to own that. It affects the way that people think about the things that they do. And it's not a huge change. It's a subtle change, but I think it could be an important one for helping people feel more satisfied in the decisions that they make.
It makes more sense. So rather than, for example, signing an 18-month-old on a soccer team, letting the individual grow up into their interests and their preferences.
Yeah, and that's the real sad thing about the 18-month-old example, which is honestly the most extreme thing we've ever seen in this. But what it does, think of an 18-month-old, for the next 10 years, the only sport that child is going to do is soccer. And so they might be the best diver in the world. They might be the best baseball player in the world, but those sports will never find that child because they're streamed into the high performance soccer pathway, and that's where they'll stay, at least until the end. And if they don't progress to the next level, they're gone without having developed any kind of movement experience in a different activity.
Would you say maybe that those 10 years, though, of only professionally training in soccer would lead them to become maybe the best soccer player? Do you think extensive amount of nurturing this skill often breaks or could break a ceiling of potential in other athletes?
That's the assumption, right? That's why they want to sign these kids into these programs. They don't work out as much as I would argue we need them to in order to be able to make those decisions for an 18-month-old. If the 18-month-old wants to do that, only wants to practice soccer, and we want to provide them with the opportunities to do that and the coaches to nurture that and all that kind of thing, if it comes from the child, and it's hard to say, how do we see whether it comes from the child at 18 months? But if we could say, the child is driving this behavior, the child is driving this engagement, then I'd be a lot more comfortable with that kind of pattern of development.
This kind of individually motivated career pathway, we can say, versus a system selected way of entering these fields. What do recruiters and people who actively work in the industry, I should say, feel about this kind of feedback?
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation to have with them because the evidence is clear that these predictions are not good. The accuracy of the forecasts are very poor, but we still have scouts and recruiters and coaches that have to make these decisions. Athletes still have to get drafted in order to make it to these professional leagues. And so it's not enough to say, hey, slap them on the wrist and say, don't do this. You have to provide them with tools and opportunities to get better. And the way that we do that is by convincing them that this is the most complicated thing that we ever ask a human to do, to be able to predict someone's long-term future. And so it's not easy. And so, we also have a system that requires scouts and recruiters and coaches to do this. So it's not a question of can we get 100% accuracy? It's can we get a little better than we are today? That's an easy argument to make with people at professional sports because any increase in accuracy you give them is competitive advantage for them over the peers in their system. And so we start with breaking down, here's the problem, here's how bad you guys are, but here's how you get better. You get better by, better data, by thinking about this problem more complicated, in a more complicated way, a more complex way. And here are the tools to help you do that. So it's very, it's not all doom and gloom. It's the bad news, but then the good news.
Mm-hmm. And in breaking down this problem, I'm curious, how did you go about researching this topic? What measurements did you use? Who did you ask? What people you spoke to?
Yeah, we're lucky in that we don't focus on a single sport. And so we've been able to take little pieces of this puzzle from different sports that have different demands and different maybe opportunities and advantages for looking at this question. So we can look at the issue of height, which is a nice, clean sort of indicator of talent in basketball players or volleyball players. And what you find is actually quite interesting. Height doesn't predict a single performance variable in the NBA, but you'd never say basketball players don't need to be tall. And the reason it doesn't is because everyone in the NBA is tall. So there's no variability in this thing. And so what it means is height is an important indicator early in the pathway for selecting athletes, but it's not a very helpful indicator later in the pathway when everyone is already tall. So these kinds of questions, when you look at sport as a whole sort of ecosystem instead of focusing on one sport, it allows you to look at this problem in a more complicated and complex way, which I think is really the solution to this problem is, hey, this is complex stuff. This is chaotic stuff. This is the very limits of statistical prediction. And so let's treat it as a complicated, complex thing and not as a simple thing that we can identify as early as possible. That's part of the problem, is thinking that it's simple.
Mm-hmm. And if it's something we maybe might never find a way to describe accurately, actually, do you think we might be ever able to describe or create a criteria that captures this sort of complex relationship without leaving all of the gaps that our current definition of talent has?
I don't think so. And I'll back that up by saying the world of sport is the most complex ecosystem that we ever try to predict, because every piece of data that we get, any model that we create using existing data is something that explains the past. Sport is famous for continuing to evolve over time. And so when we work with Olympic teams and things like that, we focus on, it's not enough to understand what kind of performance won in Paris last year. We actually have to adjust our models to predict how the performance is going to evolve between Paris and the LA Games in 2028. That's so different from music. It's different from art. It's different from all other areas of human endeavor, because the sport continuously tries to evolve in ways that are unpredictable, which means that any kind of prediction that we make is going to be limited in that sense.
True. There's a kind of short-sightedness to apply old criteria to a field that is changing, as you said.
Yeah, the outcome is changing. The performance we're trying to predict is changing. The people, the cohorts in the system are changing. The social and environment that is around the sport that the athletes develop in is changing. There's no element of that system that's stable. That stability is necessary to develop these kind of long-term predictive algorithms that you're talking about.
And if one of the main reasons why this idea of talent is too stagnant for the ever-changing field of sports, just reaching a little bit beyond sports, because you mentioned music, and I know similarly, for example, violinists infamously are trained very, very young. Would you say an idea of talent would be more applicable to them, or is it similarly faulty?
I think it depends on what we call talent, right? One of the elements that we want parents and coaches to focus on, if they need to have some kind of thing that's going to predict the future of this person in front of you, whether that's in music or sport or whatever, the thing that we want them to focus on is the thing that is going to predict their long-term engagement in the practice. So do they enjoy things that most people wouldn't enjoy? As a musician, do they enjoy practicing scales and those types of repetitive, boring, monotonous things that most people struggle with? Do they like that? If they do, then they're probably well suited for long-term practice of those types of things. Same thing in sports. Can we see indicators that you don't have to drag this person to the pool every morning? They want to get up and practice. They want to be in that environment. Well, if they do, then you probably have a pretty good indicator, at least maybe one of the best that we've ever seen, that's going to predict long-term engagement, which is actually the variable that's most important for long-term success. And so when we get them to focus on that thing, it's kind of a double win, because we actually focus on something that I think is a bit better predictor of long-term success, but it also focuses on the process of athlete development. This is a person who's evolving over time, who needs to be nurtured, who needs to be supported. It's not a algorithm to be solved. It's not a recipe to be created. It's a person that needs to be nourished. And so that, again, a subtle change that I think makes a big impact on how we think about athletes.
It reminds me of, I don't know if it's quite a saying, but this idea that you can learn a lot of skills and a lot of abilities, but you can't learn passion and genuine interest for something. Maybe would
Yeah.
you say that's what makes a successful athlete?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the really the black box of long-term development is the lack of understanding we have about motivation and how it evolves over time and in different contexts and across a person's development. But it is the elephant in the room. If you're not motivated, if you don't have the passion and the intrinsic drive, the best coaches in the world can't give that to you. But if you have it, then the best coaches in the world can structure the optimal learning environment. But it starts with that motivation element.
Though motivation is still a little bit, as you said, we don't understand too much about it. So, would it be possible to, if a child were to grow up only knowing the sport, for example, soccer, would they maybe develop a motivation and passion for it that maybe naturally would not have been there?
I think so. And that's the role of another variable we don't understand real well, which is culture, right? Like there's a reason why the best hockey players in the world come from Canada and Sweden and the US. It's because hockey is part of the culture there. And so that reinforcement of what are my friends doing? What do my parents value? What's on the sports cast every night on my television? Certain sports are promoted within certain types of culture. It's why we love hockey here and in Australia and India, it's cricket, and why we don't really produce great cricket players here yet because the culture hasn't promoted that type of development. And so you're right, this environment that a person grows up in is probably a pretty profound influence, but it's hard to tease that out at the different levels of, how variables affect a person's development.
Yeah, at some point it starts to become almost a question of like what makes a person, even, and that's diving into several layers of science that no one's managed to touch yet. But if we've kind of established talent is on its own not a reasonable criteria to use, then why don't we just get rid of it altogether?
Because I think there's the flip side of that, and that was the sort of take-home message from that paper was maybe we should do a better job of educating people about what talent is, how it changes over time, how it evolves and adapts with experience. Because the easy answer is let's get rid of it. But that assumes that it doesn't exist. It assumes that what we ask coaches to do is simple. And we think, no, let's, for lack of a better term, double down on the complexity of athlete development. And part of that complexity is talent. And that we think that's a better approach instead of just getting rid of it altogether because it emphasizes how complicated and complex this relationship is.
So instead of using talent as a criteria through which to decide the fate of young athletes, more so using as a way to say, hey, there's a lot we don't understand about why an athlete is a fantastic athlete. So we'll call that talent and we'll accept it as this unknowable thing for now.
Yeah, I think talent is a useful term for stats nerds like me who don't have to operate in the real world. Like it's easy to sort of theorize and conceptualize about what talent is. But to operationalize it for coaches, for recruiters, for scouts, that's really challenging, maybe even impossible. So let's not say it doesn't exist. Let's convince coaches and scouts and recruiters that you can't measure it. And so don't try. Focus on the things that you actually can measure and what they mean for long-term predictions. And forget about the idea of talent, at least now, until we come up with some stable and valid way of measuring if that is even possible.
Yeah, and beyond sort of the impact this has on the recruiting industry and the resources allotted to the athletes, how does this pervasive use of the term talent and this idea of talent impact the athletes themselves? Like as they go through these stages, what do you kind of see happening to them?
It's an interesting question, and I think we're just starting to unpack, but the effects that we're seeing so far, at least anecdotally from people in the system, are pretty profound. So I was working with a high-performance soccer program in Europe, and they were talking about the challenge that they were having with kids in their junior national team program, that they show up in this high performance training center. They get the full, uniform of the national team. And everyone has been telling them for the last, between 5 and 10 years that they're just so talented. but they don't develop the ability to work hard. And so eventually they get to a point in their development where they have to switch from being the most gifted player in every group to now being a bunch of equally gifted or equally skilled players. And the thing that's going to help them develop to the next level is hard work and more persistence, more effort, more focus. But they've never had to develop those skills because everyone told them they were so talented. And so, again, that's the interaction between these things is you could have talent that helps you be a great under 7 or under 9-year-old player, but you don't stay that player, and the people you play against don't stay the same. Eventually, the system will find where your weakness is. And if you don't have the skills to be able to move to the next level, then all the talent in the world isn't going to help you.
It's kind of like that analogy of like the big fish in the small pond.
Absolutely. That's the one we use. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Moving into the bigger pond and realizing that this idea, this golden idea of being talented and like mystically good at something, ultimately lets a lot of people down when they
it does, and it does, and what we're very careful of is to not have the individual take all the ownership if they're not successful, because the downside of the 10,000 hour rule or these types of real emphasis on hard work is that the reason you're not successful is because you didn't work hard enough, which is also a damaging thing for an individual to take on themselves. I could have been great if I just worked harder. Well, no, that also presents a relationship that's too simple. It's hard work at the right time in the right environment with the right advantages. And some of those advantages are genetic, some of them are socioeconomical, some of them are cultural. And so it's, again, recognizing just how complicated and complex this web of variable interaction is.
Almost at the heart of it, we have this idea emerging of how important the language and terms we use inside the field of sports is and our understanding of what these terms mean. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The talent really was the tip of the iceberg for us for a whole program of research that we have now that looks at tightening up the language that we use. A great example is, should we ever call a group of high-performing under 11-year-olds elite athletes? Is there baggage with that word that is actually counterproductive in terms of their long-term development? Should we be thinking about them in terms of being elite at that age, given the predictions are not very good for long-term success? The language that we use is very powerful in terms of affecting some of these outcomes. And so maybe we need to, be a little more considerate of the words that are used, especially with young athletes.
Mm-hmm. The words we hear, the environments we're in definitely have like this resonating impact on like how we perceive ourselves in the world as we grow up. And especially for young athletes, would a lot of their environment, I would imagine, would be like around their parents. And we've heard this idea of sports parents, maybe, and people who want to nudge their children, so to speak, in like a very specific way. How can we go about, I guess, addressing that aspect of it? Is that something we can even address in like a grander scheme of things?
I think so. We take a little bit of a different tactic to some of the things that we've seen in ice hockey arenas or minor soccer programs where they try to remove parents from the stands because they're too noisy or too disruptive. We start with the assumption that parents are there not because they're monsters, but because they want what's best for their child. And if you start with that, then the challenge becomes, how do we convince them about what the right behavior is? If they're focused on their child becoming an elite performer in 10 years or 15 years or however long that takes, how do we provide them with the tools so that they are promoters of that journey instead of obstacles? And because of the power of the parent with children, removing them from the environment we think is counterproductive, because a great source of motivation comes from their parents. A great source of attraction to the activity comes from their parents. So don't remove them, engage them. And so the thing that we've done is to clarify what the role of the parent is. So the parent's job isn't to criticize the skill development stuff that the coach does. That's the coach's job. They're the expert in that area. The parent's job is to be the 100% unmovable source of support for that child. And so when you're going home in the car ride after a bad game, you don't criticize the technique. The coach will do that. They'll provide that correction. You provide the support because that's going to be the thing necessary for long-term engagement. And so when you talk to parents and you convince them that the best role that you can have is to be that unwavering source of love and support for your kid, well, now we've given them a role. We've told them what their job is. And that's something that they can embrace a little bit more than just trying to remove them as, obstacles in the system. We can figure out a better way to integrate them.
Mm-hmm. That's a heartwarming message, I think, at the core of it. The idea of the criticisms and the critiques can come from outside sources, but ideally home should be where you can be supported, regardless of how harsh the critiques become.
Yeah, absolutely, because the reality is, the point less than 1% are going to become elite level performers. And so we really should be caring about that 99% who we want to develop a love of sport, that are going to want to be active for the next, 6-7 decades of their life. We don't want to mess that up. The likelihood of them becoming superstars should be our, second, third, fourth priority. Number one priority is, am I making sure this person loves the activities that they're doing and wants to continue when I'm not there to drive them, to provide that support, to, pay for the fees? Are they going to be somebody who wants to do this as a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old? Let's not mess that relationship up.
For sure. And you mentioned before that you yourself were a high-performing athlete. Do you have any personal, experience with this idea of talent, how it impacted your athletic journey?
I don't know that I got into my sport quite late. And so it was one of those questions of, boy, what could I have done if I had started earlier? But then I look at my own, I'm somebody in their, mid to late 50s who loves sport, who tries to do as much sport as I can. And so it's hard to look at my experience as a failure of high performance sport because, look where I am. I don't get to this spot without everything that's happened to me. And so it's a really tough question for me to answer. Yeah. And it's, if I was in a different sport, if I'd grown up in a different culture, do I end up in the same place? I don't know that I can answer that question. What I could say is it's an open question. I don't know that I couldn't have been better if I'd started earlier, if I had more support, if I'd, done things differently. And the fact that that's still an open question, I think is meaningful because it, again, reinforces how complicated and complex this is.
That's true. There's a multitude of pathways that could have been taken, but we're on the ones we're on now, and it's working out pretty well.
Yeah, and there's evolutionary biology likes to use this metaphor of, if you rewind the tape of history and play it forward again, do you end up in the same place? And I really like that analogy for thinking about our own development because it helps us emphasize, the meaningful experiences that we've had, the meaningful things that have happened to us that have probably been those forks in the road that you've actually ended up in the right place.
And speaking of the places we are in and the places we're going, where are you planning on going next with your research?
We're still doing a lot with this idea of talent, and we're working with a lot of high-performance organizations to help them understand how they can do this process better in a more holistic way that doesn't have the same sort of negative social implications. So we're doing a lot of data modeling in sports. We have a really interesting research program on the psychology of selection, how coaches and scouts and recruiters' brains work when they have to assess and evaluate athletes, and how we can help them overcome some of the flaws that our brain has and how we make those kinds of decisions. So that's really fun. And then I've got an amazing group of graduate students at the moment that are doing such interesting and exciting work in a lot of different sports that, every day is just so much fun.
Very happy to hear that. And speaking of fun, this was a very fun time, and I think we're just about time to wrap up. But thank you so much for coming on to Curious Campus.
No, it was my pleasure. This was a really fun discussion, Cynthia. Thanks.
Yeah, it was very insightful, this idea of talent. It's so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And at the heart of it, it's really just something that's so unknowable.
Yeah, and I think that I gave a lecture to some undergrad students last week, and my advice to them was people are going to try to find what your talent is and put you in a box, and you should try to avoid that whenever possible and figure out, the right place for you.
Yeah. And with that wonderful concluding sentiment, that concludes our episode of Curious Campus with Professor Joseph Baker. If anything you heard today interests you, definitely check out the paper Joseph Baker wrote called Is It Time to Retire Talent from Discussions of Athlete Development, and many of his other publications and works. Stay tuned to Curious Campus.